Hello friends, welcome back to our channel. In this video, we are going to explain the moral law within by Immanuel Kant. So without any further ado, let's get started with the video. Immanuel Kant was one of the most influential philosophers of the 18th century. He made significant contributions to almost every field of philosophy. In this video, we will discuss his theory of ethics. According to him, what is the source of our moral obligation? What is the nature of that obligation? And how do we determine the right course of action? Before we begin, if you are new here, then make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Kant's ethical theory can be found in his book called Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In this book, he tries to answer questions like, what does morality actually mean? Where do our moral obligations come from? And how do we decide whether an action is right or wrong? For Kant, the starting point of the moral life is the realization that we are rational beings. As rational creatures, we have the capacity to make decisions based on reason rather than just following our desires or instincts. This ability sets us apart from animals and is the basis of our moral responsibility. After establishing this, Kant then asks, what does reason tell us about how we should behave? To answer this question, he introduces the concept of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is a kind of universal law that applies to all rational beings. It is not just a rule for one particular situation. It is a general principle that tells us how we should act in any and all situations where we have the ability to make a choice. But what exactly does the categorical imperative say? Well, there are actually several formulations of it, but the one that is most commonly used is this: act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. What does this mean? Let's take an example. Suppose you are walking down the street and you see someone lying on the ground who looks like they need some help. You could just keep walking. After all, it's not your problem. But if you stop and help them out, you might get hurt yourself. Still, you feel compelled to help them. Why? Well, because you know that you should help people in need. You also know that if everyone else acted like you did, the world would be a better place. So what does this tell us about how we should act? According to Kant, the right thing to do is always the thing that we could universalize. In other words, if we can imagine a world in which everyone acts according to the same maxim that we are following, and if that doesn't lead to any contradictions, then our maxim is a good one. However, if it does lead to contradictions, then our maxim is a bad one. Let's go through another example. Suppose you make a promise to a friend that you will do something for them, but then you decide that you don't want to keep that promise because you don't feel like it. Can you break your promise? No, because that would lead to a contradiction. If everyone broke their promises whenever they felt like it, then no one would ever trust each other again and society would fall into chaos. Therefore, according to Kant, we cannot universalize the maxim that allows us to break our promises. And since that is the case, that maxim is a bad one. This way of determining right and wrong actions has some important implications. First, it means that there are some actions that are always wrong, regardless of the consequences. For example, lying is always wrong because we can't imagine a world where everyone lies to each other all the time. Second, it means that there are some actions that are always right, regardless of the consequences. Helping people in need is always right, because we can imagine a world where everyone helps each other out, and that doesn't lead to any contradictions. Finally, it means that we cannot simply appeal to consequences to justify our actions. If we want to know whether an action is right or wrong, we must ask ourselves whether we could universalize the maxim that governs that action. This brings us to the second part of Kant's ethical theory, namely his idea of perfect and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are those duties that we must always fulfill, regardless of the circumstances. An example of a perfect duty is the duty not to kill. Imperfect duties are those duties that we should fulfill if it is possible, but we may sometimes be excused for not fulfilling them. An example of an imperfect duty is the duty to help others. The reason why there is a difference between perfect and imperfect duties is that we can derive perfect duties directly from the categorical imperative. We can't derive imperfect duties from the categorical imperative. Instead, we must use our reason to determine what we ought to do in particular situations. We can see the difference between perfect and imperfect duties in the example of helping someone who is in need. We have a duty to help them because we can universalize the maxim of helping people in need. But we don't have a perfect duty to help them. That is because we could imagine a world where everyone helped everyone else out all the time. But such a world would be very inefficient. Sometimes we need to look out for ourselves and not always put the needs of others before our own. Now, you might be thinking that this seems very rigid and unyielding. What happens when two perfect duties conflict with each other, such as when we have a duty to tell the truth, but also a duty not to harm others? How can we decide which duty we should follow in that case? Well, Kant says that in such cases, we must follow our reason and determine which duty is more important. Let's take an example to illustrate this. Suppose you are a doctor, and one of your patients asks you whether they should get a certain medical procedure. The procedure is experimental, and there is a good chance that it will not work. As a doctor, you have a duty to tell the truth, but if you tell the patient the truth, you will cause them unnecessary anxiety and fear. So what should you do in this situation? Well, according to Kant, you should follow your reason and determine which duty is more important. In this case, the duty to not cause unnecessary anxiety is more important than the duty to tell the truth. So you should not tell the patient the truth. Of course, this is not an easy decision to make, but according to Kant, that is the price that we pay for having a duty to use our reason. Finally, let's talk about the third part of Kant's ethical theory, namely his idea of autonomy. Autonomy is the idea that we should be free to make our own decisions and that we should respect the autonomy of others. For Kant, autonomy is closely related to the idea of the categorical imperative. In fact, he says that the categorical imperative is itself a kind of expression of our autonomy. When we follow the categorical imperative, we are making our own decisions based on reason rather than just following our desires or the commands of others. Autonomy is also closely related to the idea of perfect duties. As we saw earlier, perfect duties are those duties that we must always fulfill, regardless of the circumstances. One of the reasons why these duties are absolute is because respecting the autonomy of others is also absolute. We must always respect the autonomy of others, even if doing so conflicts with our own desires or interests. For example, suppose you are planning to do something that you really want to do, but then you realize that it will violate the autonomy of someone else. In that case, you must change your plans and do something else. This might sound inconvenient or unfair, but according to Kant, it is always wrong to violate the autonomy of others. It is also important to note that Kant's theory of ethics is not the only theory of ethics. There are many other theories of ethics, and each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. Some people prefer utilitarianism, for example, while others prefer virtue ethics. Ultimately, it is up to each individual to decide which theory of ethics they find most convincing. So this was the moral law within by Immanuel Kant. If you liked this video, then make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Also, if you have any suggestions or opinions regarding this video, then do share them with us in the comments section. The postulate of the moral law within is one of Immanuel Kant's most profound insights, and is central to his vision of ethics, freedom, and human dignity. By this phrase, Kant refers to the universal moral principle that resides not in external authorities, social conventions, or divine commands, but deep within the rational nature of every human being. It is the voice of pure reason calling us to act out of duty, independent of desires, inclinations, or external pressures. For Kant, the moral law is not something imposed from the outside. Instead, it is discovered through the exercise of reason itself. When we reflect rationally on what it means to act morally, we find within ourselves the requirement to follow principles that are universal, principles that could be applied consistently to all rational beings. This inward moral law is most famously expressed in the categorical imperative, act only on that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The within part of this concept is essential. It highlights that morality does not depend on fear of punishment, hope of reward, or the commands of authority figures. Instead, every rational being carries the source of moral obligation inside themselves. To obey the moral law is not to submit to an alien force, but to act in accordance with one's own rational will. In this way, Kant links morality directly to autonomy. We are free precisely because we give the law to ourselves through reason.